live?
Yes, your address,
I
please.
live in Philadelphia, 2350 Tremont Street.
And do you live in an apartment?
I live in an apartment,
Huh. And what is your apartment number, please?
407.
Okay. And today is February 23, 1992.
Right.
Okay. And would you tell us your date of birth
March 14, 26, 1926.
and where were you born, please?
I was born in Hungary.
And can you tell us where in Hungary?
Nyírbátor.
Would you spell that, please?
Nyíbator.
Could you tell us what part of Hungary that is in?
It would be the Middle Eastern part of Hungary.
Do you have any brothers or sisters? Or
No.
did you have any brothers or sisters?
I had a half-brother and a half-sister.
And your half-brother, would you tell us what his name is, please?
His name was Andy.
Hertz?
Yes.
And when was he born?
In 1932.
And did you say you also had a half-sister?
Yes, her name was Eva, and she was born in 1934.
And was she also born in Hungary?
Yes.
In the same town?
Yes.
And was she, were these half-brothers or half-brother and sister on your father's side or on your mother's side?
We had the same father.
Okay. And would you tell us the name of your father, please?
Miksha Hertz.
And could you tell us his occupation?
He was a merchant.
Could you tell us his date of birth?
April 15th, 1896.
Do you know where he was born?
No.
And your mother, her name, please?
Her name was Regina Goldstein.
And do you know
She was born in approximately 1899. I don't know her birthday.
Okay. Your half-brother, Andy, was he in the Holocaust?
Yes. He was in Birkenau, Auschwitz-Birkenau. He got as far as.
Is that where he died?
I believe so.
Okay. To the best of your information and knowledge, that is where he died?
Yes. Also my sister and my stepmother.
In the same camp?
Yeah.
And what was your stepmother's name?
Her name was Aranka, A-R-A-N-K.
And do you recall her maiden name?
If you give me about 20 minutes, not offhand, but I'll think of it. She was my stepmother, and I can't think of it at the moment.
Now, your mother died before the war?
My mother died, yes, before the war.
Can
in
you
1927.
Can you tell us the conditions under what she died?
I really don't know. She had some sort of an infection that, they were not able to handle at that time.
This was shortly after your birth?
It's about 8 months after my birth.
And your father died?
My father died in 1944. In 45.
And where did he die?
He died in Dora.
Would you tell us what Dora is?
Dora was a concentration camp that I was in. He was with me. And that's where he died.
Can you tell us, were you taken a prisoner by the Nazis or the German government?
In Hungary. We were taken in Hungary into a camp, I guess a disbursement camp, and that's where we were there for several weeks before we were sent to Auschwitz.
Were you captured or taken by the members of the Hungarian government or members of the German government?
Mainly the members of the Hungarian government.
Did the people who take you, was there a name of this organization or?
They were the local militia. There was no name.
How old were you at the time that you were taken?
In 1944, I was 18 years old.
Could you tell us a little bit about what you were doing at that time? Were you employed or were you in school?
No, I wasn't doing anything. There wasn't anything to do at the time because my father had a business, and for all intents and purposes, that was not a functioning entity. And I was an apprentice for learned a trade before the Germans came, and I worked. And that's by trade. I'm a furrier, and I worked as a furrier for a short while.
Furrier, dealing with.
Dealing with furs, and make fur coats.
Was that the nature of your father's business,
No.
or
No, my father was in the textile business.
you did not work for your father?
No.
You indicated that you were taken in 1944.
Mm-hmm.
Was your whole family taken?
Yes.
Did this include your half-brothers and half-sisters?
Yes.
And your stepmother also?
Yes, and aunts and uncles and everybody who lived in the town.
Could
All
you?
the Jews.
And this was in the town in Hungary that you just named where you were born?
Yes.
Would you describe the process of how you were taken?
Local officials came into our home and told us to pack. And we were taken into the synagogue, one of the three synagogues that were in our town. And we spent the night there, and the next day we were taken to this particular place where we stayed for a few weeks before we were taken to Germany.
What did you take with you when they told you to pack and meet it and come to the synagogue?
Clothing of various kind, food stuffs, and things of that sort. Immediate necessities.
Do you know what?
They might have told us what to take. I don't recall, or how much we could take, but it was essentially what we could carry.
Do you know whatever happened to the rest of your property?
Yes, it's still in Hungary.
You said it was set. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Our furniture was sold at an auction the following day. This is what I heard after I came back to Hungary, for pittance, for whatever people offered.
Where did you spend the few weeks before you were taken to Birkenau?
It was in a place called Shimapusta.
Could you spell that?
Yes, SimapusZTA.
Can you tell us what kind of place this was?
It was some sort of a farm complex, because it had barns, more than one or two or three. It was barns enough to house, I think hundreds of people. And it just, appearance-wise, it looked like some sort of a farm complex. Now, whether it was built for that purpose or it existed and was just converted, I don't know. I know it had railroad tracks leading in to it, because that's where we went to Germany.
How were you treated, and what were conditions like at this place?
There was no special treatment. We were left alone. We weren't working, and there was no special treatment that I can recall.
Were you fed by the?
Oh, I'm sure we were fed. Yes. We also had some of our own food. I don't remember the details to that extent, but I imagine we were.
Did you perform any work at this
No.
this place?
There was no work required in that place.
What were you told as to where you would be taken and what you would be doing?
I don't particularly recall being told anything. as an 18-year-old, I don't recall, ever officially being informed of, anything or any plans that I'm aware of that I can remember. We were just, following orders and we were taken.
Were there anything said about resettlement or future work?
Not in an official capacity. There was talk going around, even as far back as in Hungary, that they were going to, resettle the Jews, us in a different place. But I don't recall ever being officially told that we are going to be resettled anywhere.
Was there any rumor or was there any knowledge among the people that there's a possibility that you or members of your family or others might be killed or murdered at where you were being taken?
My father had an idea that we were going to be, yes. And, but he was exceptionally wise and intelligent, and most people did not want to believe, as people don't want to believe these things. But he was a realist, and he sort of had experience, and he was aware of what was going on.
Do you know what made him think or believe that the Germans might kill him or other members of your family?
Well, as I said, he was very intelligent, he was very aware, and he was very much up on current events. We had, radio, we used to listen to the BBC, and we knew what happened to the people, that Germany conquered before us, or had an idea, and there was no reason, for any realist to think otherwise. That'll happen to the people in Hungary. We heard, about the Polish and the Austrian and the Czechoslovakian. And my father was, as I said, just, had enough foresight to know it's, the inevitable. Or at least having a good idea.
In your life in Hungary, were you brought up as an observant Jew or an Orthodox family background?
Yes.
Can you tell us how you were taken to Birkenau?
We were told to board railroad freight trains, and from the place that I mentioned to you, Shimapusta, and the families were, since we were together, families boarded on the main, the same coaches, and that's how we were taken. Now in Birkenau, there were SS troops who supervised the boarding, in addition to the local militia. And this is how the boarding was arrived.
Were you in cattle cars, or were these passenger cars that you were taken in?
We were not in a cattle car. We were in a completely closed car. Cattle cars usually have vents in them, and they're not completely closed.
When you say
there's ventilation that a cattle car has. They have slats for side walls. This was a completely closed. It was just a freight train, a covered freight wagon.
Can you tell us what the conditions were inside this car that you were taken in?
The conditions were what conditions are if you're in a place for about 7-8 days with, overloaded with people. And I, having been 18 years old, and 50 years has elapsed since or more, I am not really aware, of gory details, but there were plenty. I mean, there were dead people in the car when we arrived to Auschwitz, and that's what I can tell you.
Can you tell us anything about the sanitary conditions or hygiene conditions? Were you allowed to ever leave the car during this 7 or 8 day trip?
Not that I recall. No, I think that uh, they had containers of various kinds that one could urinate or use for bowel movement and such in the car. And I don't particularly recall paying attention as to how these things were emptied or if they were emptied or and but anyone can imagine what conditions are under those circumstances.
So you were never given an opportunity to clean yourself or...
Not for those 8 days, no.
How about your food situation during that time?
I really don't recall. I still think we had some food, and I also think that we were also given some food. But you see, these are minuscule daily functions that one can't remember. 50 years later, as to whether you were fed. I don't recall it being especially starving. That would have made an impression on me. I was in situations where I was starving, and I do remember those. In this particular situation, I don't recall. So they might have given us some food.
You said
In addition to foodstuffs that we might have had left over.
You said some people died in your car during
Yes,
this journey.
some people were dead, upon arrival to Auschwitz. What they died of, I don't have the vaguest idea. I don't know. They might have been ill. They might have been, in need of medical care. I don't know.
Was it totally dark in this car during this whole 7 or 8 days that you traveled?
Yes, it was an enclosed car.
There was no light whatsoever?
There was a little window, an opening, above, fairly high above, with bars, on it. Whatever light, that let in. That's the extent of it. And we have stopped, I think, maybe on occasion. I really don't remember, these details. And whether they opened up the door twice, it's immaterial. What difference does it make? I don't know. I don't remember.
Do you remember the time of year?
Yes, I remember the time of year. It was approximately, I think they took us away from my hometown into this disbursement camp around the beginning of May.
So weather conditions were generally nice?
They were not, extreme, yes. They were already going into spring.
What did people do in the cars, or in your particular car, with people who died? Were they moved to a side, or were they just left where they fell? Or
I don't know. I did not see any dead bodies during the trip. However, I did see him when we arrived. I don't know. I did not really pay attention to those things.
Were conditions crowded in your car?
Yes, they were.
Do you know how many people were in your particular
No,
car?
but it was loaded up.
Was there room to sit down at all?
Yes, there was room to sit down and possibly even to lie down. I mean, the space that you fit in. Could you shut this off now? I want to go.
When you arrived in Birkenau in Poland in 1944, would you describe what happened when the train finally came to a stop at Birkenau?
The train pulled in to a platform. In fact, one of several platforms. It was early in the morning, and it was dark, and there was an effect that was, I would say, quite dramatic, because the crematoriums were going at full blast. In other words, what my first impression of arriving and disembarking from the train was these huge chimneys, with fire and smoke coming out. It was somewhat in the foreground ahead of me. But that's the first thing that I saw after disembarking from the train. And of course, I was with my father, and we were made to stand in row, in line, in a group formation. And after a while, we were asked to march towards uh, it was on a platform, and we were marching on this platform where there were offshoots to the right and to the left. And at that point, there was a German officer, and he asked us some questions. I understood German, as did my father. And the questions, I think, had to do with what was our occupation, and to which my father answered that we were machinists, and they asked us to go this way. And women and children were asked to go to the right. And of course there was no time, because we were marching all together, and it was just a selection process that certain people were asked to go to the left, and you couldn't kiss goodbye or say goodbye, and certain people were asked to go to the right. And we were, my father and I think a couple of my uncles, we were asked to go to the left, and we were taken into a camp. And at that time, I really didn't know whether it was Auschwitz or Birkenau. And to this day, I'm not really absolutely sure, because I only spent 9 days at this place. But we were taken into a camp. We were stripped of our clothing. I don't know whether I can relate this to you sequentially, or whether but all these things that did happen. I don't know whether it took us to the barracks first, and then we were stripped of our clothing, or we were stripped of our clothing first, and then we were taken to the barracks. But at any rate, our head was shorn. If I remember correctly, there was a line shorn into the middle of our forehead. We were given these the uniforms that they gave out to what they called the Heflings, with blue and white stripes and caps. Shoes we were allowed to keep. We were given a shower. We were given a delousing type of a treatment. They brushed us with some sort of a disinfectant, and we were taken into a barrack that had essentially like bunk beds, that type of arrangement. And they were all men, and people slept on the bed. How many, I really don't remember. I don't know whether they joined one another or they were actually separate, but there were groups of people. I think certain beds had joined one another. That for the few days that I was there, that's the remembrance that I have of the place.
What happened to your half-brother, Andy?
My brother and my sister went to the right instead of to the left, and I have seen some Holocaust films, and I'm absolutely certain, I couldn't tell you where or how, and I was trying to find out what it was that I think I saw my brother Andy in one of these films. But I really don't know at what segment or at what particular film. There's several. But they went to the right. My stepmother and my sister and my half-brother.
Do you know what happened to them?
No, I don't know what happened.
Did you ever see them again?
No.
You mentioned that when you arrived in Birkenau and you departed from the train, that you saw the crematoria or the smokestacks. Did you know at that time what they were?
My father did.
Did he tell you what they were?
Yes. And I had an idea because the town that I lived in Hungary, uh, which was not the same town that I was born and raised in, but my grandmother's, where my grandmother lived, they had a crematorium. And I sort of had a fairly good idea as to what it was.
What did your father say to you? Do you remember?
No, no. Actually, if you never knew what it was, the stench, that was about at that time, was pretty near, enough to tell you as to what it was.
Can you describe the
It was the
smell?
stench of burning flesh, the odor of burning flesh, and that type of an odor.
Did that odor pervade the camp?
I don't know. I don't recall the proximity of this landing platform and the entrance to this particular place where the crematoriums were was uh, quite close. And if I remember correctly, the camp barracks were somewhat removed. And of course, this thing was not operating at full time all the time. It happens that when we arrived, this thing was going full, but it did not. I have never seen it again because I was never up again at that time of the morning where first the impression would have been made and, it would have been that, dramatic. But it was very dramatic at that particular time, at 4 o'clock in the morning.
So you had no opportunity to say anything further to your half-brother and sister and stepmother during the selection process?
No, nobody did anything.
Do you know if the person who was making this process was Dr. Mengele, or did you see him at all?
I had no idea.
But you were sent to the left, and these other family members were sent to the right.
Yes. I know it was a German officer in a leather coat, but I would not know who he was.
Did you know what he was using as a basis for deciding whom was to go to the left and who was to go
I
to the
don't
right?
know. I do know that we were asked ourselves, my father, and the question was really directed at my father as to what we were doing, what our occupation was. But I don't know what questions were asked subsequent or prior of people. I know what was asked of us.
So
my father had my father was a prisoner of war. Was a prisoner of war in the First World War, and he was pretty knowledgeable to the extent of the operation of these things. And he told me that he felt that you always make yourself available for work, because as long as you're available for work, they're not going to do away with you. Whereas if you're not, they have no use for you. They didn't need you to feed. They needed you to work.
So that is why your father
so that
gave
was
an
his
occupation?
criteria, right, of giving the occupation of machinist. My father was not a machinist. My father was a textile merchant. And, but as I say, drawing from his experiences as a prisoner of war in the First World War, he decided to do that.
Were you or your father tattooed?
No.
Did you see other people who were tattooed?
No.
Did you know that people were given numbers or tattooed numbers on their arms?
Subsequently, and even while I was in other camps, I've seen people with numbers. Yeah.
Can you tell us what the living conditions were in Birkenau during the time you were there?
I was in this place for about 9 days. The living conditions were such. People weren't working. There was minimal food. I happened to be in a fortunate position because one day one soldier came around and asked who speaks German, and I spoke German, and they asked me to be like a cabin boy for where the German officers stayed. And I went there every morning and did chores, cleaning up the place and whatnot. And at the end of the day, when I was coming back to the barracks, I was always, able to bring some food back with me, which I, shared with my father and my uncle. And so for me, the conditions were pretty good. And but all in all, it was very bad because I was not, there during the day, so I don't know whether these people got any food. But I know people were very, very hungry.
What was your uncle's name?
I had two uncles. One's name was Isidore, and one's name was Armin. They were my father's brother.
Do you know what happened to them?
No, I don't. Then I had my father's first cousin. I don't know what happened to them either.
Were they separated from you in Birkenau?
Yes, they did not come with us to our future destination.
Did you ever see them again?
No.
Have you been able to determine at all whatever happened to them?
No. I never tried.
Do you know what your uncles or your father did during the day while you were away doing other chores and work?
They did nothing. There was no, work. They, you know, as you say, moseyed around, hung around, stayed in the barracks or outside the barracks. Whether there was any official duties or any official request for performance, I really don't know. But I don't think there was anything. I do know in the morning when we got up, we went to what was a community, I guess, bathroom and washroom. And about atrocities, that was the first occasion that I have seen any sign of such. And the way the thing was built, there was a row of spigots, and then there was a row of toilet seats opposing, and then you could wash yourself and go to the toilet seat. And it was a long barrack. I mean, must have been maybe on both sides of the walls. Must have been maybe, I don't remember exactly, but possibly 100 or 80 of these spigots and toilet seats. And at the end of the barrack, there was a corner that was boarded off with like pieces, it was like a little room, just sectioned off, but you could see between the wood that the wall was made up of. In the cracks, if you look through the cracks, one morning I looked through the cracks, and I saw a mountain of bodies, and it took me unawares, and I asked my father to come and look, and he saw it, and he told me that these were the bodies that they brought in from the gas chamber, and but they were just in a heap, in that corner, and that's what happened in Birkenau.
How much time were you given to use the toilets and facilities? Were you? Oh.
That time was not of an essence. There was no, as far as I remember, I don't recall any regimentation or any time schedule or anything like that. I don't even know whether there was a time, it must have been when we had to get up, but not anything like when I was in the work camps where there was a particular time to, you had to get up. I don't recall. As I say, I was only there for about 8 or 9 days.
Were you given a uniform to wear?
Yes.
Would you describe it?
It was blue and gray stripes with sort of a beret type of a cap, and shoes if you had your own, and if not, they supplied you with some shoes with wooden heels and soles, with a wooden bottom, canvas top with a wooden bottom, and various and sundry. I think they might have given. I think there was like an overcoat or a blanket, that they have supplied, but I don't recall those things.
Were the heads of your father and uncles shaven also?
My uncle, yeah, everybody's, all your body hairs were shaved. Your pubic hair, everything was shaved.
Do you know why they shaved that part of the...
They gave you this, as I say, disinfectant, the delousing solution. I am sure after being in the train for days and, being under no sanitary conditions being available, I am sure that was the reason.
Did they even shave hairs on people's chest as well?
I don't recall. I really don't recall. I just recall pubic hairs and the head. And the head, of course, was shaped that you had a line in the middle of your head. Your hair was at a certain length, and then, the shorter, let they shaved a line into the middle of your head.
Do you know what the purpose of doing that was?
It was obvious, so you could be recognized as a prisoner if you, by chance, escaped.
Did they paint any marks on your uniforms, X's or any other signs on your...
I think there were numbers. I'm fairly certain there were numbers on the left side, but I don't recall exactly.
Did you have blankets or pillows or hay or anything to sleep on in the barracks?
Yeah, the beds, the bunks had something. I don't know if there were pillows, but there was some. I did not sleep on wood, so there was something there. There was just, the preponderance of the cloth and clothing that piled up underneath. I don't know.
Did you see anyone die in your barracks?
No.
After you were there 8 or 9 days, you said then you were sent
And then
away.
we were sent to a different camp.
Do you know why you were sent away from Birkenau?
The place that I was in Birkenau was not a place where they kept people on a permanent basis. And that was, I think, also a disbursement place where they sent people to different places throughout Germany. The place I happened to go to was Markstadt 5. And
Would you tell us
that
what...
was a train trip. I don't know how many days duration, but it was summertime already, so it was, and of course we were sent to work. And I worked in that place for about 6 months.
At
For a
Markstadt...
company that's still in business, by the way, and the American government is still helping.
And what is the name of that business?
Krupp.
Krupp. K-R-U-P-P.
Okay.
So you were sent to Markstadt 5, which is in Poland also.
The translation of 5 is 5 lakes. 5 is 5, Teichen is lake.
What type of camp was this?
That was essentially a working camp that consisted of barracks, and everybody in that camp except the people who were in the infirmary had a couple of barracks of infirmary, and had a barrack that was where they cooked the food, was the kitchen, and of course, the guardhouses and the outer guards. But essentially, it was a camp that consisted of I don't know how many, maybe 20, 30, 40 barracks, and the people there worked at this place.
How many people were in the barracks?
I don't recall at this point, but I would say we each had a bunk bed, a top and bottom. If I'd guess about 80.
Were you with your father?
Yes, I was with my father.
What type of work did you do at this
I worked
camp?
for Krupp, and I operated an overhead crane that was moving machinery parts from one section of the factory to the other. The factory was made up of lanes, and where machinery was lined up on either side, and this overhead crane was running on a rail. And you took things out from what's lathe machines and put them into another one. If they were completed, you put them into a spot. And I also was used to unload raw materials that was coming, that were coming in from the outside to be processed. Essentially, what they did there was they processed parts of airplane engines and also mortar shell. These were the things that they were making there. So I was operating the crane, and my father was used to sweep the halls of the factory. He was working with a broom, and he was also fortunate that he was unloading the meal for the civilians from the truck during lunchtime. And he was also loading it up at the end of their lunch, and he was able to, salvage whatever was left over and, use it, give it to me for him. But that's what my father was doing.
What were living conditions like in this camp?
They were primitive, but they were not terribly bad. I think they gave us 2 meals, one in the morning and one at night. And they had to keep us in some semblance of condition that, we were able to perform work.
What were you fed?
Mainly soups and some things in the soup. I wouldn't know what it is. And I don't know how it broke down, but there was, I think at the beginning, maybe a half a bread per person, or maybe even a full one, that, as the war went on, got less and less and less. And so what we're given was some liquids in the morning and a piece of bread and something at night. That was a one, plate type of thing.
Were you given any meat to eat during this time?
Something that was meat, yes.
When you say half a bread, how much bread are you talking about?
Well, the size of maybe a small rye bread, half of it. The food, you could subsist on the food. In this particular camp, on Sundays, when the factory was not working or operating, there was actually a soccer field, and people were playing, soccer. So people were in fairly decent condition, and they also had an infirmary of sorts.
How many hours a day would you work in this camp?
I think we got up around 5, and we got back around 6. We had to march from the camp to the factory, which I imagine was maybe a mile or 2, something like that.
So you would be working almost 12 or 13 hours a day?
Something like that, yes. Actually, it may have been a little less because they had a lineup sort of type of thing before we actually started. So, it wasn't from the time we got up, but I don't remember the time. It must have been maybe around 8 o'clock.
And I think you said you spent about 6 months at this.
Yes, I spent from about June till January of 45 at this place.
Then where were you sent in January of 45?
January of 45, the Russians were approaching, and that's when the marches started. And from this place, which was about a 6 or 7 day march, and we marched about maybe 6, 7, 8 miles a day. So it was about 50 miles away was Gross Rosen, which is the place that we went to.
Can you tell us about this march? What the conditions were like? How you were treated?
The conditions, I only remember the first night of the conditions because the first stop that we made, they ordered us into, it was again some sort of a farm complex, and we ordered us into what to me looked like some sort of a farm a barn, and it had like a loft to it. And the next morning when we got up and to continue the march, all I saw was on the outside were bodies frozen stiff. And those were people who could not fit into any shelter. And this was in January, and this was in Poland, in Silesia. And the temperature would be, I would say, equal of maybe Quebec, Canada. And all these bodies were just laying on the ground, frozen. That's the only impression I had of that place. Anything else, was dwarfed by that sight. And then, of course, in the morning they gave us some rations, to eat, and we started the march the next day. What I also remember is people who fell by the wayside were shot to death by soldiers in the back of the head. These were people who could not move and just fell down, and soldiers were at maybe every 20 and 30 paces with dogs, and whoever fell out of line was just shot to death. This was during the march. So of the people that started from Markstadt from Teichen that actually arrived at Gross Rosen wasn't too many.
How many started the march?
I often wondered, I don't have the exact number, but just trying to picture the barracks, I would say must have been maybe 6,000.
And do you know how many finally arrived at Gross Rosen?
Not too many. In the hundreds. Because this scene, repeated itself over and over again. And my father and I were just happened to be very lucky. Anybody who survived just happened to be very lucky.
These soldiers, were they members of the SS?
I really don't remember whether they were soldiers, whether they were Wehrmacht or whether they were equally ordered to shoot. It didn't really matter who they were, because I know that in Markstadt from Teichen, one day, one bolted out of the line when we were going to work, and on each side of the road there were some fields, wheat fields, I think, and they ran into the field and they just shot him. So whoever, I think in Markstadt from Teichen there were no SS. They might have been the Wehrmacht. But it didn't matter who they were. They equally all followed orders.
Were men and women in this march?
No.
All men? Do you know what happened to
I was never together with women except in Bergen-Belsen.
Do you know what happened to the people who were shot?
No. I have no idea.
Do you know if they were picked up by anyone or just left on the roadside?
We were marching. Not too many people bothered to look back. And it's not conditions that people under normal circumstances can understand. It belies logic and reflex and everything else.
Could you be shot for just looking back?
I don't know. I am not saying that you would be shot for that. But not just because of the fear of being shot. There was total disinterest, as to what happened to the person next to you. There's nothing you could do. Occasionally somebody was helped for a while, but you did it at your own, peril.
What do you mean when you say there was total disinterest?
People were marching, guarded by German soldiers with guns at every 20 or 30 paces with dogs. Not too many people turned around.
So there was nothing.
They followed orders. That's what I'm saying.
So there was nothing you could do but just to keep
marching. No, nothing anybody attempted to do. I mean, it was folly to even think of doing that.
What was your health and the health of your father at that time?
It was very good.
How old was your father at that time?
In 44, he was 48.
And how many days did you march before you arrived?
It seems to me we marched about 5, 6, 7, 8 days. I don't remember exactly, but we didn't march for too long a period of time. We arrived at Gross Rosen, and we stayed at Gross Rosen for a few weeks. And then from Gross Rosen, and this is the only trip I don't have any recollection of, but it was by train, I know that. We were taken to a place called Dora.
Before we talk about Dora, could you tell us what you did at Gross Rosen and what
Just
conditions were like?
lounged around, it was a camp where they had, I believe they might have had permanent prisoners. But I think that what happened at that particular time, that the camp was so overloaded because of, the advance of the Russians, that they were bringing people in from all over or all around. That, the part that I was in was really not, there was no regiment and there was no organization. I think people were just kept there until they were to be transported farther. There was no pattern or regimen or anything that I remember about Gross. It had a crematorium, that I know.
What kind of camp was Gross Rosen?
Gross Rosen, from what I saw, to me it was just a one-dimensional thing because I only really saw my barrack. But it was on a hilly, whereas the others were flat. This was on a hilly terrain. And as I say, I don't even remember where, for instance, where the kitchen was, because I pretty near well stuck to the barrack that I was in.
Were you with your father at this time?
I was with my father all along until my father died, like 2 days before he died.
Was there any opportunity to develop any kind of relationship with others in these camps? Or did families pretty much stick together, or did people who had no families pretty much stick to themselves?
There was certainly no organized attempt of developing relationships, and relationships did develop. It was by sheer coincidence. I don't think anybody there was. I personally remember a few people who were with me, but I just happened to remember them, but not because there was any continuity to the acquaintanceship or, developing a relationship. It was a very one-dimensional thing, which was survival. And social enmities and interactions was not something that was practiced. That's it.
What did people talk about?
Uh, what people talked, I really don't know, because most of my time, it was really, I was really with my father pretty much all the way. And my father, told me things. My father and I were not close. My mother died when I was like 9 months old, and my father remarried, and our relationship really has not developed. And I don't remember my father ever talking to me, as a matter of fact, until I was like maybe 17. That may sound strange, but, he had a lot of problems with relationships. But, once we were in the camp, and he saw, so to speak, the handwriting on the wall, that he saw that this could be it. He confided in me about things that, for instance, about monies that he put away, and jewelry that he hid, in particular parts of our house and our garden and so forth. And, he confided in me, and we sort of actually developed a relationship of sorts in the camp. And the only thing you were really worrying about is getting enough food and getting cigarettes that you traded for food. And that was your daily, function. Every once in a while, a German guard who marched along with us uh, gave us, some pretty decent, that won't be long and it'll be over and so forth. But it was a rarity. I'm sure you don't hear that mentioned too much. But this was when we were going to work, every once in a while there were some Hungarians in the German army. I see certain part of Hungary was occupied by what they called the Volksdeutsch, which were Germans living in Hungary, and they always considered themselves Germans. And during the war, they joined the German army, but they spoke Hungarian and German. So every once in a while, one or two gave us a little encouraging, it'll be over soon and so forth.
When they were referring to it'll be over soon or won't be long, were they talking about living or the war?
I have no idea what they were talking about, but we chose it to think that these were positive remarks as opposed to, all other remarks that we had from guards was just to march and, just hit the road and, stay in line and, so there was no remark, there was no interchange of conversation between a guard and a prisoner, except just to move along and follow order. So when these people spoke to us, and especially to us in Hungarian, we knew who they were. And so it sort of, injected a little bit of what we deemed to be a little positive. Whether it was, I don't know.
Were any holidays observed, or was there any religious observance at all? Did people pray, or?
Yes, people prayed, but there was no official religious observance.
Was the Sabbath observed at all? Was there any attempt to observe?
Why would you even think that this would happen? What prompts you to ask this question?
Were there, did you see Orthodox Jews who tried, for example, to observe any semblance of religion?
To the extent that some might have prayed. It doesn't strike me as as a happening, but it might have happened. I'm not aware of.
For example, if someone died, did anyone say Kaddish, or was there anything like that at all that took place?
There was no dying and burial. This is not the way it went. And people didn't die and got buried. I don't recall too many people dying per se in Markstadt Fünfteischen. This was the work camp. If they died, they might have died in the infirmary, in which case we didn't know what happened to them either anyway. This place had no gas chamber or crematory. And so I don't know what happened to them. But this was not an environment where any social type of activity, to any extent, took place. If it did, it was just an individual, something that somebody, people just were in fact very selfish, very ruthless, very mean prisoners, as well as guards. And they were, it was their survival that was at stake. And that's one of the atrocities that what they did to decent people.
Did you see people beaten? Were you ever beaten, or was
My
your father?
father was beaten. I was not beaten. My father was beaten. To tell you the truth, I don't know why, but he was getting like 15 or 20 lashes with a rubber hose. But that's the only direct atrocity, that I can remember.
Who beat him?
I don't remember whether it was a soldier or whether it was what they call a capo, which was one of the prisoners selected as to being in charge. Then they had in every one of the barracks, they had a head person that was sort of in charge. So I don't remember who actually administered the beating, but it was not a life-threatening or that severe a thing.
Where was he beaten?
Where, you mean where in location?
Yes. What camp was
At
this?
at the March 5th station. In front of the barrack, he was beaten on his backside and bent over and just, nothing unusual.
Do you recall what country Gross Rosen is in?
I think it's in southern Poland because I think that was near Breslau.
When you were
Yeah, I think so.
when you were being marched, did along the way did you ever see the townspeople or civilians come out at all to witness or watch?
Not much. No. There were townspeople that were coming in on Markstadt from Teichen. They came into the factory. They were with us. I was there for 6 months. So I had communication with German civilians, machinists and engineers and civilians in general.
Did any of these people ever help you by giving you food or anything else?
Nobody ever gave me any food, and I don't recall anything one way or another, other than the work assignment that one was given. And my father had access to food because he was loading and unloading the food kettles that was going into the dining room of the civilians. But these people, you see, the people that were in the place where I was in touch with civilians was a work camp. And these people might have just thought that we were workers who were capped in a particular place. And these people might not have been aware of what happened in Auschwitz. They might have been just aware of what happened every morning. These workers, these prisoners came into work. But there were civilians there. And there were, of course, Auschwitz was near a village. So there's no doubt that the civilians. And we did see some civilians by the roadside during the march, but few and infrequent. The marches were I only actually had one march on foot, and that was in the middle of the winter. It's January the 5th or 6th, and not too many people are hanging out.
Did you ever see a civilian on this march try to give any food or help anybody at all?
No, there was no such thing, and I don't know if it could have even been attempted.
What is Dora?
Dora was a camp that I arrived from Gross Rosen, and there again, as we went in, people asked for your expertise, and I, having been an apprentice farrier and actually becoming a journeyman in Hungary, was able to sew by hand. And they asked as to whether anybody can darn socks or sew by hand. And I volunteered that I can sew by hand. So they put me into a place where I was darning socks, holes in socks. My father, this is where my father and I got separated, was in a different part of the camp, and I really don't know what he did. And the camp itself consisted of a factory built in a mountain. In other words, railroad trains and entrances went into this mountain. And on the outside, you saw nothing except the camp. And inside, of course, was where the activity took place. And this is the place where, as I said to you before, they built the V2 rockets, or one of the V. And it was a camp where I saw several people hung on occasions. And but as far as my own personal living condition, as I say, I was working in a room, and I don't even remember as to, I probably slept in a barrack, and I went over to see my father, who was in a different part of the camp on occasion, and one night I went over, and he was sick, and he couldn't eat his soup, and he gave it to me. And the next day I went over and they told me that he wasn't there. They took him away. He died. I was not able to, find out ever what happened. But I think that he had dysentery, and he, as I say, from one night to the next, he was gone. And this was in sometimes around March of '45. And it was just shortly before we got liberated. So he almost made it, because I was liberated in May of '45. I was in Dora for about maybe a month and a half, 2 months, and then we were taken from Dora to Bergen, Belgium. But Dora was, again, a camp, a work camp, serious manufacturing going.
Did your father know how serious his condition was?
I don't know, and I, did not speak to him about it, and it's just one of those things, see, seriousness in the everyday sense of normal human life cannot be translated into feelings and language of what took place in the camp, because there is no resemblance to those feelings. What you imagine to be real or fantasy or imagination here is totally different there. Relationships are not to be compared. Father and son were just totally different. What you would think a father would do for a son or vice versa is not necessarily a condition that would exist in a camp. So if you're trying to make any basis of comparison as to humanities and so forth, people were stripped of those things, by then anyway.
Can you tell us how you felt when you went back and your father was gone?
I really couldn't even tell you that. I don't know how I felt. I felt sad. I was trying to find out, as to there was nobody to find out from, to begin with, because there was no director of the building who would tell you, wait a minute, your father was taken to such and such a place. But I could just ask some of the inmates whose last thing in their mind was as to what happened to my father. And some have told me this and some have told me that, and I did follow it up to the extent that I could, but I had no, result. So this is not in any way a situation where one person's fate or life or wellness or illness is of any importance. This is, those things did not exist. And it did not even exist amongst the inmates. And there was, I've had no occasion except for, things that happened to me. There was no time for mourning. And there was no time for feeling sad if you saw a way of surviving, or if you, just happened to be alive. Feelings were not demonstrated in those places.
So the last time you saw your father...
The last time I saw my father was one evening.
And he gave you his soup because he wasn't feeling well.
And to this day, I feel very guilty. If you're asking me about, feeling, this is what I feel guilty about, that I took the soup from him, and I sort of, was reluctant, and he said, you can't eat it anyway. And I sort of took it and sort of enjoyed it, because it was extra food. I was like 19 years old, and I was in good health. And but in retrospect, You know, the older I get, the more guilty, and you know, the more the situation affects me. And I did not have, for all the years, I wasn't thinking about it. And as I said, the older I get, the more the impressions, you know, have an effect on
Were you always hungry, or, or many times felt hungry during this time that you were in these camps?
me. You know, it's a funny thing. I was really never that hungry, for one reason or other, and I can just attribute it to luck. I have always managed in Birkenau. I was selected to be like the cabin boy for some German officers, so I had my fill of food, of scraps. In Markstadt Fünfteichen, my father handled some food, and so I had enough of that. In Dora, before they took us away from Dora, Dora was being approached, I believe, by the Americans, so they took us further north. As we went to the train, we went through the kitchen, and there was meat cooking in the pot. And I just reached in and I grabbed 2 hunks of, you know, beef and stuck it in my coat pocket. So I had what to eat until I got to Bergen-Belsen. And I was just very, very fortunate.
You stated that you saw people being hung at Dora.
This was just, you know, while we were standing in the morning. I think there was a, what do you call it in the morning when there is sort of the counting of the heads.
A roll call?
Sort of a roll call type of a thing. And one morning, I remember being in roll call, and there were the gallows, and there were like 5 people hanging off of that.
Do you know why these people were hung?
I have no idea.
No explanation was given by.
Oh no, no.
I mean, no warning like these people tried to escape or did anything that.
No, there's none of these things. People have to understand that nothing that you or the average person considers a human happening today and tries to interweave into the existence in a camp has any semblance of reality. None of those things happened. Prisoners were not owed, given, offered, considered anything. There was no explanation or medical treatment or somebody was sick or anything like that. You know, they got what they had there at the moment. So, I mean, if people try to sort of weave into any kind of human feeling or any humanity, it was none. This was an organized, machine-like type of an operation. There were no deviation.
How much time did you spend at Dora?
Let's see, it was liberated in 45, May the 7th, and that was maybe the month of April. I probably spent about a month and a half in Dora, approximately.
And how did you go from Dora to...
From Dora to Bergen-Belsen, I went by train.
And
this was an open train. It was like a platform with just a little side of that type of a train. I don't know what the name of that is. And during our transport or trip from Dora to Bergen-Belsen, ahead of us, the train station was attacked by American planes. So we had to lay over until the rail was repaired or rerouted and whatnot. And this trip was done by train. This was like in March. It was not excruciatingly cold. And as I say, I had the food that I took out of the kitchen, so survival was, comparatively easy for me.
Did you see people dying at this time as well?
Not at that time, no. Did not.
And how long was the trip before you arrived at Bergen-Belsen?
I can't give you exact days, but figure 3-4 days, something like
And can you tell us what is Bergen-Belsen?
Well, Bergen-Belsen was actually, it was like two camps. One, the one I was in, by then, I don't know what it was before we got there, but by then there was no curriculum. It was just people being there. There was no work detail or anything that I have seen. And then there was a camp where the bulk of the people there were ill. They had typhoid. As a matter of fact, somebody told me to go over there, and because they told me there's plenty of food there. So a friend of mine and I, we went over there. And we stayed there, and we never contacted typhoid. So, as I say here again, I always was lucky with food. Then there was another camp in Bergen-Belsen that housed prisoners of war, South Africans, because they were in Fezes, so I think they were Moroccans, and but essentially it was just a commingling of an awful lot of people. Now there, they had women. There I was walking through buildings, like they had a building full of clothing, and walking through, bumping into dead bodies. It was pretty well disorganized at that time. And there was really just a matter of, by the time I got there, the people, who were running the place pretty well knew what was happening. That the end was, near. They had Hungarian soldiers, by the way, in Bergen-Belsen, as part of the people who were guarding the prisoners. And I spent about 5-6 weeks there, and again got lucky and got through, because lots of people died there, of typhoid. And I don't even know if there was an organized, way of or gathering of food or giving food, but that was really like the end for pretty well everybody, the Germans as well as the prisoners. Until one morning, I got up and I saw a German tank on its side with a white flag on it, and I knew it was over.
Did you do any work at all at Bergen-Belsen?
I didn't do any work, no.
Who liberated Bergen-Belsen?
The British.
Do you remember the date that you were liberated?
Well, May the 7th.
1945. And what did you do after the British came into the camp?
After the British came into the camp, they were, of course, captured. The administration building, then, British forces came in, and some of the Germans that were captured, they were made to bury some of the bodies, that I sort of witnessed for a while. And I wasn't really that interested in it. And then from there, we were taken to a displaced persons camp. And this particular camp was in a place called Celle, C-E-L-L-E. And it was not too far from Bergen-Belsen. I don't know how I got there, whether by train or by a British truck. But we stayed there, and there, of course, things became more organized. And I think this was, again, a disbursement camp of sending people back to their country of origin, the ones who wanted to go, and everybody pretty near did. And I went back to Hungary from there.
Before you left Bergen-Belsen, did the British soldiers do anything to help you, or the Red Cross or any other organization?
I was not in need of much help. And the only thing I remember is that when the first contact that I had with the British was a jeep pulled in front of the administration building, like early in the morning. And a friend of mine and I, we went over to the jeep, and we knew it was over. And there were 2 cartons of cigarettes on the seat, and my friend and I took it. And then, of course, we went into the prisoner of war camp, and we got whatever we wanted for cigarettes. And then officially, of course, the British, doled out food. I remember getting Lipton soup. It was my first, meal there, and Spam. This, is my first meal that I got officially after liberation.
What was your health at that time?
It was good. My health was always good. I could not have survived if it wouldn't have been.
How much time did you spend at the Zella?
Cella. At, it's May. Probably maybe a month.
And what did you do there?
Oh, nothing. It was, you did what you wanted. It was, you were free. And you could walk into town, and, we did some things. We went into the countryside a little bit. The houses were abandoned. Went into people's cellars, and if we saw something, we took, like wine or, conserve or food, things like that.
Who took care of you during this time? Who provided you with food and shelter?
British.
The British.
They had medical corps, and they had, they have taken care of us there. I don't really remember sequentially or even in detail. The city was snippets of time, and without anything major or startling happening. I mean, I just happened to be liberated and lived in a place for 3 weeks or 4 weeks. But I do know, because I have used the infirmary, I developed blood poisoning in my foot, and that was taken care of, by the British. And I also know that I ate, and I also know that I was, taken by truck to railroad, to a train, to go back to, Hungary.
What happened when you returned to Hungary?
Well, when I returned to Hungary, I arrived at Budapest, and I went back to my hometown.
And what did you discover in your hometown?
I had two hometowns, because I lived with my grandmother for a while, and I lived, with my parents. I had a stepmother, so I spent a lot of time with my maternal grandmother.
She survived?
No, she died. She died on the day that I arrived in Hungary, and it's amazing. They were taken to Austria, and she was given an upper berth on the train. And coming home after being liberated, and she was at that time maybe like 80 or something, she fell off the upper berth and she died as a result of that. But she died the day I arrived at Budapest. It's strange, almost to the hour. And as I say, I went back to my hometown, and my cousins were already there. And they were all, at my parents' house. And we stayed there for a period of time. And I had contact with my uncle who lived in the United States, because we needed some papers, to immigrate. Our intention was to immigrate. And we received papers from him. Could you shut this off a minute? I take some.
You decided not to stay in Hungary.
Yes.
And I believe you told us that you returned to Germany.
Yes, we went back to Germany.
When you say we, who is...
My cousins, and some second cousins, and who all stayed in my house for the period of time after the war that we went back to Hungary until we departed in 46. Went back to Germany.
What was the reason for you to return to Germany?
The reason was to migrate to the United States. And the organizations, I believe, if I remember correctly, were more in working order in Germany at that time than they were in Hungary. The IAS and UNRWA was operating already. And we saw chances to be better to get to the United States from there than from Hungary, which was occupied by the Russians.
How did you feel about going back to Germany?
I had no particular feeling about it. I mean, it's hard The hardest part for people to understand is the question you just asked me, how did you feel? Because I feel that there are connotations as to whether I should have felt anger, remorse, sorrow, or other, negative or sad feeling. None of those things, happened to me because it was still too close to what has happened. I was 19 or 20 years old. I was well. And as any 19 or 20-year-old thinks, he's thinking of his daily existence, what he's going to do tonight. We got back to Germany. We went to dances, and we lived in this DP camp in a fairly normal way. And when you're 19 or 20 years old, you don't miss too much.
Which DP camp were you in at that time, when you returned to Germany?
I don't know the name of the camp, but I know the name of the street that I was on. It was a street called Sedanstrasse. It's spelled Sedan.
Was it? Do you remember what city you were?
Ulm. Ulm. Ulm am Donau. That's in the southern part of Germany, near the Swiss border.
How long did you stay in this?
We stayed there from 46 to 47.
And what did you do during this time?
My cousins got a job in the office and worked, performed some clerical duties. I myself didn't do much, and we just, spend the day. It was all right. I had a lot of friends. I was 20 years old.
How were you taken care of, or who took care of you, as far as food and shelter?
We were issued rations, and I lived with my cousins, and we had no problem.
How do you feel about Germans today? Or what has taken place in Germany, such as the reunification of the country?
I can't express my feelings about the Germans. I can express my feelings about the people who helped the Germans. I can express my feelings about people who buy German products. Hate is not a strong enough word. I know of no strong enough word in the English language to express my feelings. I also, and I hope you don't edit this out, have strong feelings for people who get survivors and get their stories, which I'm very willing and happy to give, and use the stories as stories, rather than making demands from the German government for me to receive reparation. I lost my family, every part of my family, to this country that I am helping to be functioning and to be prosperous, without them giving me 1 cent, except telling me that they passed some rinky-dinky law that I'm not eligible because I was 10 days too little. I spent 10 days too short a time in their camps. That's what I have feelings for. And this is what organizations ought to be working on, is for people who spent time in Germany to get reparations instead of me and my taxes. I worked all my life in this country. I had a business. And part of my tax money went to establish Germany instead of the other way around. So that's what my feelings are about. I have no words for the feelings that I have for the Germans. I hope they all disappear from the face of the world, without exception. Young, old, infant, senior, makes no difference. Woman, man, child, all of them. That's the way I feel about the Germans.
You also mentioned that strong feelings against people who helped the Germans.
Yes.
What people are you referring to?
All people. all people who have any feeling, and that includes a lot of Jewish people, who, for one reason or other misguided reasons, feel that this is something that can be corrected, forgotten, adjusted, make believe that it didn't happen, or it partially happened, or what's the sense of, continuing it. And because of those reasons, either want to make peace or want to establish relations, or, I'm giving you my feelings. I don't know how practical they are, but that's the way I feel. And that's the way I feel about anybody who buys a German product. Because I don't think they really know or care as to what they are doing. And that's the reason why I feel somewhat reluctant to give my story, even though I think the story is useful. The reason I am giving it is, for one thing, my daughter asked me to do it. For another thing, that I am sure that there are people who are interested and will possibly garner something out of it. But I'm sure a lot of people are just curious, or are just doing it for self-aggrandizement. And I hate to be so blunt, but that's the way I feel. And but again, there are people who are genuinely interested and will put it to useful purpose, which is, of course, one reason why I'm doing it.
What led you to decide to come to the United States as opposed, for example, going to the state of Israel?
This is a very good question. What really led me to come to the United States is that all my cousins have come to the United States that I happen to be with, and because on my mother's side, all my family went to Israel. So would I have wound up at my maternal grandmother's place? Chances are I would have gone to Israel. And the reason that I think I gave to myself at that time was that I'm a furrier, and they have no reason. I have no reason to go to Israel. They have no winter there. They need no fur coat. And so I decided. But really, I think I came because, it was just all my cousins came.
When you came to the United States, was that in 1947?
47.
And
April 17th.
you went into the furrier business?
No, I went to work for somebody in Philadelphia. I was here for about 3 days. And I was fortunate enough to find a job in the afternoon, part-time. I also enrolled in a public school. My linguistics are pretty good, and I pick up a language very easily. And I've spoken German, and English and German to me is very similar. So I have spoken, I have gotten to a point where I had a working, knowledge of the English language, where, I was able to get around, get a job, and I went to work.
Can you tell us a little bit about your family here?
Yes, I'm divorced. I have 3 children. I have a son, 41, a daughter, 37, and a youngest son, 31. And 2 of them are married. My youngest is single. And 2 of them live in Philadelphia, and my daughter lives in Atlanta.
What do your children do?
My oldest son has a business of his own. He's in a telemarketing business. My youngest works for Ford. And my daughter is a housewife.
Do you have any grandchildren?
Yes, I have, 7. I have 6 boys, 5 grandchildren, 6 grandchildren, excuse me. I have 5 boys and a granddaughter.
Are you presently working?
No, I am helping my son in Philadelphia. He's not well, and I don't per se have a job, but I do whatever I have to go out there. But I have my own business. for many, many years.
Your own furrier business? Is there any final thing or comment you would like to make for this tape before we conclude this interview?
I don't know whether there are really words to express as to what I feel about what has happened. I don't know whether there are any remedies available to either alleviate or in any way alter what has happened, feeling-wise. And therefore I'm at a loss of words to say I am not a forgiving person. I cannot imagine any circumstance that I would forgive those who did what happened in Germany or who are part of what happened in Germany, and that includes the American government, who did not let the St. Louis embark in the United States. And I feel that these things and these feelings are still around. They are a little bit underground and subdued, but they're still around us and they're still abound us. And these people there are people who still feel that what has happened is just and would be willing to do the same thing all over again. However, if they would try, I think and I hope it would be at a much greater cost, because they paid nothing for the first time, but I think they would pay for the second time because of the state of Israel. So that's my feeling about what has happened. And I think that anything that anybody can do to strengthen the state of Israel, ought to do, because it's very important that they exist and are strong, because that's the only insurance that the people, the Jews in the diaspora, have. And that's the only insurance they have that it may not happen again at any time, because nothing has changed. The ecumenical goodwill is just so much below it. We have basic differences. It's still being taught amongst the Christians, and until that changes, and until truth is told, nothing will change. We have genuine anti-Jews living all over the world who have no compunctions about repeating the same thing all over again.
Mr. Hertz, on behalf of the second generation Children of Holocaust Survivors Group of Atlanta, we very much appreciate you taking this time to allowing us to interview you and to videotape you so that this tape can be viewed by future generations to learn about what happened during the Holocaust. And today's date again is February 23, 1992, and it's a Sunday. And again, we thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure, yes.